Hello everyone, I'm back for another video, continuing my series. I guess it's kind of a series on the Nephilim, sons of God and the Nephilim in Genesis 6, just who they are and things like that. If you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Shavar. I'm a Christian and I make YouTube videos discussing everything, but from a biblical perspective. So let's get into this video. So this video is going to be about the descendants, who are the true descendants of Adam, and the idea that, from my belief, that I don't actually believe that the human species today that exists, are actually the true descendants of Adam, that we are not direct descendants of Adam, that perhaps we have a tiny bit of Adamic blood within us, tiny bit perhaps, but we are not actually direct descendants, which we've been told that by Christianity, and I want to challenge that. And so let's get into it. So in order to understand this and for me to make an argument for this, we have to first discuss the flood narrative. Why did God bring the flood? And how did the Nephilim return, basically, after the flood? So let's talk about that. So first, I want to talk about why God brought the flood. And the Genesis 6 narrative, if you read it, it tells us the reason why God brought the flood. He brought the flood because of the corruption of man, that he says that he regrets that he had made man, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually, and that it was uh, the sons of God procreating with women, the daughters of men, that brought about the Nephilim, and that these Nephilim beings corrupted humanity by teaching them forbidden knowledge. And they also, there's reason to believe that they corrupted the environment, and they also were doing experiments with animals and corrupting um, the animals, basically. Now, it's told to us that that's why God brings the flood. And sorry, I'm trying to look at something here that the corruption of mankind was great on the earth, meaning that they were doing all kinds of different things. Like I said, experiments with animals and things like that. They were corrupting the environment. They were corrupting the original state of creation in which God made creation. And there's also reason to believe that the Nephilim were they were making war, and they may have been making war with the descendants of Seth, who were, the descendants of Cain. The Nephilim were probably going to war with the descendants of Seth and perhaps killing them off and things like that too, which would have been grievous, since the descendants of Seth are fully human. They were fully human, and they were the ones who had the rightful heir to the earth. They had the right to rule on the earth. And the Nephilim were pretty much going to war and overthrowing them and taking their right and basically usurping them in a way, right? And If you want to know who the Nephilim are and what my opinion on who the Nephilim are, go watch my previous video on the Nephilim. I talk about the Nephilim origins and where they came from. But the Nephilim were overthrowing the descendants of Seth to usurp their authority on the earth. And this was probably the main reason why God brought the flood and killed off all of humanity. But also, it was just to kill off the descendants of Cain, who were hybrids. They were hybrid humans. They were part human, part primate, and God did not. That is actually what the seed of the serpent is. The seed of the serpent is, the serpent was an animal. We see in the garden that the serpent is a beast of the field. That it was an animal, and that the curse of Cain, that the curse of the serpent was imputed to Cain, I believe, and that Cain, and that the Nephilim were to descend from Cain, who were hybrids and tribrids and things like that. And that was kind of the punishment that God brought upon Cain. But this is kind of why God brought the flood. Now, when we look after the flood, God kills the Nephilim in the flood. So there are no more Nephilim, there are no more hybrids. And it's through the descendants of Noah. It's only the family of Noah that survive. 8 people, I believe. It's him, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Those are his sons, in which survive, and their wives, and then Noah's wife. And so they are pure bloods. Their genes are pure, and that they are fully Adamic in their genetic code. And that's what it means when it says in Scripture that Noah was right in his generation, that Noah was righteous in his generation. Many commentators take that to mean that he was genetically pure. That just means he was fully Adamic in his genes, whereas the descendants of Cain were not. And so, after the flood, since Noah's family, they're fully Adamic, how did the Nephilim return if they're all killed off? There are no more Nephilim. Now, this plays into human beings today and why we are not true descendants of Adam. I'm going to get to that, but I got to talk about the Nephilim here. But, there are many beliefs as to how the Nephilim returned. There are many views on that. Some theologians believe that they return, like somehow they survived the flood by maybe hiding somewhere, like in a cave, or which I don't know how that would protect you from the flood, but maybe underground or something. Or there are some views that say maybe there were some Nephilim that, they survived by holding on to the ark, and they were like, they were on the ark, but they were outside of it, hanging on to it or something like that. There are some people who believe that maybe, some theologians that believe that someone in Noah's family had the Nephilim genes, and they returned in that way. I don't agree with those views. I think that there's an explanation as to how they could return without holding to those views. But we know that the Nephilim existed after the flood. Numbers 13:32, Deuteronomy 3:11, 2 Samuel 21:18, Goliath, he was a Nephilim. And so we know that the Nephilim returned after the flood. And the question is, how? So this comes into and my explanation as to how has to do with the curse of Ham. Okay, now the curse of Ham, if you don't know what the curse of Ham is, it's mentioned in Genesis 9:18-29. I won't talk about what it is that Ham did. There's debate as to what he did when he saw his father's nakedness, Noah's nakedness. What is that exactly? There are different views on that. I won't go through that. I'm not gonna talk about that. Maybe in a future video I'll talk about what my opinion is on that. But I just want to talk about what the curse of Cain is, or the curse of Ham is exactly. So the curse of Ham was, Noah's son. He was a son of Noah. Ham, basically, Noah cursed Ham. Well, he actually cursed Canaan, which was Ham's son, firstborn son, for what Ham did. So what did Ham do? Ham saw his father's nakedness. Noah got drunk, fell asleep in a cave. The text is in chapter 9, Genesis chapter 9, if you want to look at it. But he got drunk, fell asleep, and Ham went into the cave and saw his father's nakedness. And because of this, Noah curses him. Again, I'm not going to talk about how the sin of Ham here works exactly, or what it is exactly. I just want to talk about the curse. Noah curses him for this, and that the curse is that Ham's descendants will be, Canaan will be a servant of servants. Canaan, who is Ham's son, will be a servant of servants, as Genesis 9:18-29 tells us. And so to get, I just want to mention, and I want to say that I don't believe the curse is skin color, some kind of skin color. It's not dark skin. There's a belief historically that some Christians have held to, and other religions have held to, that the curse is dark skin. It's, black people are cursed, we're the cursed race. And that justified slavery and stuff like that historically. It's not skin color. Okay. But it is a race. The curse is a race. It's just not based on skin color. It's the race of the Nephilim, the hybrid race. Okay. That's the curse. What I believe it is. So it's not a skin color, but it is a race, which would be the Nephilim race. So the Nephilim return through Canaan. Basically, that's the curse. He's cursing him. The curse is the same curse that God places on Cain, which was that through Cain, the Nephilim would descend through Cain. And that would be the curse, that Cain would lose his authority as a descendant of Adam, his authority over the earth, because the Nephilim are hybrids, and so they do not have authority over the earth like the descendants of Seth did. And this curse was placed on Canaan's descendants. And so what it's telling us basically is, what I believe is, that the Nephilim would descend through Canaan, and that was the curse, and that Canaan would be a servant of servants, and his descendants would be a servant of servants. Primarily, the idea is that the hybrid race is meant to, number one, either be destroyed or number two, serve God's people. And so the purpose of uh, the Nephilim or lesser races is to serve the people of God or be destroyed, one or the other. You know, so um, that's what I believe uh, the curse is there. So the Nephilim comes through Canaan. Now, what do I believe? How does that work exactly? Well, I think that Canaan, someone in his line, committed the same forbidden sin that Cain did. If you've watched my last video, I talked about what I believe, where I believe Cain got his wife. And I talk more about it in the previous video. So if you want to you want to know fully what I think about it and my explanation of it, go watch the video. But I'll just say here that I believe Cain created his wife. Okay, I give reasons why I think that in the previous video, so go watch that video. But I believe he created his wife, and that his wife was a hybrid, part human, part primate, and that he uses some kind of artificial insemination or technology to do this, and that his wife was the first hybrid human, and therefore bore the image of the serpent, which was the image of the animal image, the animal nature. She was part primate. And so I believe Canaan, someone in his line, did the same thing. They just repeated what Cain did. They recreated the Nephilim again by artificially inseminating a primate and creating hybrids, part human and part primate beings. And these were the Nephilim that we see Israel going to war with, the Nephilim kings. These were the beings that we see. That's how I believe they returned. And that's how I believe they also came to power, because they were, in a way, descendant from, the Adamic line, but they were kind of perversions of the Adamic gene code. And they ruled as kings in the land of Canaan, the Nephilim. Now, I want to get into a theory. I'm going to call it a theory in terms of who we are. I do not believe that our species, the species that exist today on Earth, are direct descendants of Adam. I think that we're descendants of the Nephilim. It actually makes sense. I'm going to get into reasons why it makes sense, but I believe that we are descendants of the Nephilim, and our species came into existence after the flood. That we're not fully human, we're not fully Adamic, and that we were created. We were an experiment, essentially, right? That the Nephilim created. And so my belief here is that, you might say, well, you're just speculating here. No, I have reasons to think that, and I'm going to get into those reasons, but the belief is pretty much that there were two species of humans that were created after the flood, with the exception of Noah's line, Noah's species. It was the Nephilim, and then there was another species. It was us. And that I believe that the Nephilim may have this is me speculating on this. The Nephilim may have overthrew uh, the Adamic line and killed their fathers and went to war with them. We actually see this in myths where the Titans are overthrown by the gods. The Nephilim are the gods, the Titans are their fathers. You can see a kind of correlation there and a connection there. You could make one. I think that is the correlation, but I digress there. I won't get into that. What I do think is that, however, that the Nephilim created us as sort of this worker race for the purpose of serving them and serving them and as kind of like a slave race or a worker race that they would rule over and that would serve them. And so the people that the Nephilim ruled over, they weren't, obviously not everyone in the land of Canaan were Nephilim. So they were ruling over individuals that were lesser than them. Maybe intelligence, strength, and all this stuff. Where did they come from? Well, they were created by the Nephilim to be their servants and to build the land of Canaan and everything in the land of Canaan. They were created as kind of a worker race. And so I think that's where we came from. And that we come into the picture after the flood. Now, an explanation in terms of other species of human, like Neanderthals and other humanoid animal hominids that we see in the fossil record and things like that. Where did they come from? Well, I believe that they were failed experiments by the Nephilim. That the Nephilim were trying to create a race that were smart enough intelligent enough to work, to follow instructions, but were weak enough to control. They didn't want us to be strong enough to rebel against them. And they were experimenting to try to create the perfect species that would fit that mold. And they had many failed experiments, likely. And Neanderthals were one of them. And all the other humanoid species that we see in the fossil record. And that could be an explanation as to where the Neanderthals came from and the other hominid humanoid species that we see. That it didn't happen through natural selection, but it was an artificial selection. It was through genetic engineering, genetic editing and modification that these species arose. And that we survived because we were the successful experiment. And that's why we survived. That we were the perfect in their eyes to serve them. We were smart enough to follow instructions and understand instructions, but weak enough so that if we rebelled, we could not overthrow them. And so when Israel goes into the land of Canaan, they kill the Nephilim. Their goal is to kill the Nephilim kings primarily. And that would free us from their rule, essentially. But our species were made to be servants of the Nephilim and work for the Nephilim. That's what we were created for. Now, the redemption in Christ redeems us from that. And he saves us from that destiny. But that was the original purpose from us, or at least Christ can redeem us from that, if we want that. And so I think that we were, it sounds crazy, but I think we were artificially produced. We were genetically, and we were created through some insemination and genetic editing and modification by the Nephilim. That we are a different species of human from the Adamic race and from even the Nephilim race. That there are many species of human. We see this in the fossil record. Like we see it. We know that there are other species that were like us or similar to us in some way, right? And I just believe we were artificially created. It wasn't through natural selection, but artificial selection. And we know the Nephilim were smart, okay? And the Adamic race was smart. We're smarter. They were smart enough to create technology, probably, that they could, create other human beings through experimentations and things like that. This idea that we were just a bunch of dummies, idiots, historically, and human beings, maybe our species, our species weren't smart enough to create these things, but if there were a greater species of human than us, then that could explain the pyramids. How did the pyramids get built? The Nephilim were teaching human beings teaching the human beings they created, that's us, how to build the pyramids. They were instructing us in how to build it. We weren't smart enough to know how to build something like that. We don't have the technology today to build the pyramids. Like if we wanted to build a pyramid, we could not do it. We don't have the technology. And so this idea that in ancient human history in these biblical times, that technology that we were primitive and all this other stuff. Look, I don't believe that. I think that there was a lot of technology was probably far more advanced than far more advanced than today. Kind of had to have been to be able to create the things that we see, the ancient monoliths and all these other things that we see. And those locations in Egypt and all these locations in Canaan and all these places, I just don't buy that we were primitive in our technology and things like that. There were probably less intelligent species than us that were probably dumb, like Neanderthals probably really were dumb, but they were failed experiments. The Nephilim couldn't use them because they weren't smart enough to follow instructions. And so they died off eventually. And so, yeah, that's where I believe we came from, our species. And that we are the last surviving species of them all. Now, some of you might be thinking to yourself, this is kind of crazy, but there are reasons to think that this is probably it's consistent. And I'm going to point out why I think it's consistent. But I think that, again, like, I want you to be a little bit more open-minded. You might think this is pseudoscience, or what does it say this in the Bible? I'm going to give a biblical argument for this. But I think that just open our minds a little bit. If it makes sense, if it's consistent, then it's probably the case. It's probably true. The most consistent view is probably the truth. Okay, this view that doesn't make sense is probably not true. And so, if you think this view is just out there, tell me what your problem is with it. Don't just say, oh, that's not the case, because you've been taught that it wasn't, or you've been taught that, that's a crazy view or something like that, and to never believe that or something like that. But because of your Christian tradition, don't let your tradition hold you back from believing things that make sense, things that have explanatory power, which I think this view does. I'm going to talk about why. Now, moving on from this, we're going to go into the reasons to believe this. And I'm going to start with the scientific data, that how this is consistent with the scientific data. Have you ever wondered why we are so similar to primates genetically? One of the arguments that evolutionists make when trying to argue that we are animals, we are primates, and that we've evolved is that our similarity in our genome to primates, to chimpanzees primarily. And they use that as when you ask them what's the strongest argument for evolution, they use it's this argument. It's the argument from genetic similarity, and that the belief that there's a 90 to 98% similarity between chimpanzees and human beings, and that they are cousins. We didn't descend from them, from the ape, any ape that exists today, but we have a common ancestor, essentially. And for Christians come back and they say, no, God created us that way because we all have the same God, and so it makes sense that God would, since we were created by the same God, He's going to use a similar blueprint to create us. They use examples like, well, if one artist creates an album with 10 songs in it, those songs are going to have be similar in many ways. They're going to have maybe a similar style, same style, because it's all created by the same creator. And they kind of use that to kind of explain it. Yeah, I mean, I get that argument. The problem is that human beings are supposed to be, that argument makes sense if you're using animals, if you're comparing animals with other species of animals. Like, why do primates have some genes from other species of animals, like felines and stuff like that? Why is there similarity between other animals? That makes sense. But with humans, that doesn't make sense because human beings are supposed to be unique. We're supposed to be special. We're supposed to be different from animals. We're not supposed to be similar to them. We're supposed to be different from them. It's supposed to be a difference between us and animals. The only similarity that we're supposed to have to animals, seemingly, would be that we can procreate and that we have physical bodies. But other than that, in essence, we're entirely different. And in our essence and role, we're completely different. And so that argument I used to use that argument, but I just don't buy it anymore. I think that that doesn't make sense. I think that we as human beings I don't think there was supposed to be some kind of genetic similarity between human beings and animals. Even though we can procreate, we have physical bodies, that doesn't mean there's supposed to be some genetic similarity. No, we're supposed to be unique from animals genetically. That's why we're special. That's what makes us special. That's what makes us different from animals. So I don't, how are we different if we're so similar genetically? So much so that we're basically animals. Just doesn't make sense to me anymore. And so to explain the scientific data, I think that it would be foolish to deny what the science shows us, which is that we are similar to apes genetically, which would mean we are primates. I think that that's, when you think about it, it's actually it's common sense, really. That I mean, this is common sense. Like that that we're mostly primate, that we're mostly an animal. That's what the science shows in our genetic code. However, even though that's what the scientific data shows, and I agree with that, that doesn't mean you have to accept natural selection and random mutation as the explanation as to why we are similar. Now, natural selection and random mutation can explain changes on a micro level, as some scientists call it, microevolution or speciation or adaptation. Yeah, natural selection and random mutations can explain that. But on a macro level, there are changes that we see between apes and human beings that I don't think natural selection and random mutation can explain. For instance, our intelligence, why we are more intelligent than apes, or the fact that we're bipedal, and we apes, they can walk upright, but only for a short period of time. They're not bipedal like we are. There's a clear difference. And so I don't think natural selection and random mutation has any explanatory power in that. Why are we the only apes that are so intelligent? I don't think natural selection or random mutation can explain that. But I do think artificial selection and artificial mutations can explain that. I think that if someone intentionally edited and modified our genes, it could explain why we are similar to primates, yet explain our differences as well. I think that makes sense. I don't think natural selection and random mutation can explain every single supposed evolutionary change that we see in species and certain kinds of animals and things like that. It can't explain all of them. Some of them are just too great. I don't think it can explain how a single-celled organism can evolve into a fish. Natural selection and random mutation can't explain that. You need new genetic information to arise in order for that to occur. Natural selection and random mutation can't do that. It can't add new genetic information. Scientists know this, which is what you would need. It can edit information, rearrange information, duplicate information, but it can't add information. And adding information is different than duplication. Some scientists try to say that it's the same, no. Adding would be new information that didn't exist within the gene pool already. It would not be duplicating information that exists within the gene pool. That's what we would need, new information, not duplicating information. And so some changes can't be explained by natural selection and random mutations. But if it was artificial, maybe it could. And so artificial selection and mutation can explain macro changes, macro evolutionary changes. It can explain the changes that we see on the macro level within human beings and other animals even. And so I believe in micro and macro evolution. I just think macro evolution is artificial and micro is natural. That's kind of how I view it. And I think that's the best explanation for what we see and the best explanation for the scientific data. Now, that is one reason to believe that we are primate, that we're mostly primate, actually. We're not just part primate, we're mostly primate because the science shows that we're between 90 to 98% similar to apes. Now, some theologians, some Christian scholars and theologians try to say, oh, it's usually scientific Christians in the scientific realm try to say, no, it's not 90, it's not that high, it's like 70 or whatever, and they try to say it's a lie or whatever. Look, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, okay? All I know is that it is higher than 50%, okay? Much higher, probably. And so that means we're a primate, but that doesn't mean you have to accept Darwinian evolution the way it's explained. If you're open to a view that maybe is more niche and maybe seems more like pseudoscience, you know, um, and myth, um, I don't believe in myth. And so, and as I said, there are stories in myths, like the Anunnaki, alien gods coming down, creating human beings by inseminating a primate. They weren't alien gods, they were the Nephilim. Okay. And our species worshiped them and served them. And because they created us. And so I think that kind of deals with some things there. We don't have to deny that we are primates, which is consistent with the scientific data, but we also don't have to accept necessarily that Darwinian evolutionary view that apes evolved into human beings through natural processes, because that would actually kind of contradict scripture. And you don't reject it because it will contradict scripture, but reject it because it doesn't have any explanatory power. The science can't do that. So, yeah. So that would be the reason from science, the proof from science, from the scientific data as to why we should believe that, yeah, we are hybrids. We are a hybrid species. So that's the first reason. Now, the biblical data. The second reason, and my next defense for why I think we are a hybrid species, and my theory here, if you want to call it that, is that it's consistent with the biblical data. And in what way is it consistent with the biblical data? Well, it's interesting because the Bible, I think implies that that genetically we are similar to a beast or an animal or the serpent. In fact, if you look in scripture, the word natural, when it talks about the natural man in 1 Corinthians 2:14, but it mentions the natural man, uses the word natural for our fallen nature. The word can be translated as the bestial nature or the animal life or the animal nature. And I used to think that was kind of like a metaphor, but I don't think that anymore. I think it's literally an animal nature, that we literally have an animal nature or bestial nature, that's the fallen aspect of us, that we are a hybrid species. It's talking about our genetic code is similar to a beast, to an animal. Have you ever wondered why we are able why human beings are capable of doing things that we see in the animal kingdom, like homosexuality, cannibalism, bestiality, all these things. Why are we able to do these things? Why are we able to commit sins like these? You think God created us to be able to create sins like these? Or to be able to commit sins like these? To do things like that? Why would he do that? You say, well, we fell. Okay, but just because we fell, that doesn't mean, why would we become capable of committing homosexuality like that, or capable of wanting to eat other people? Like it just, I don't understand that. Like, you know, an explanation as to why we're capable of doing that, and we actually see the Nephilim in Genesis 6. Enoch talks about how the Nephilim, were eating people, they were committing cannibalism, and they were committing homosexuality, and that it was their primate nature, the fallen aspect of themselves that drove them to all that corruption. And so the reason why we are able to do things similar to animals is because we are animals, but we didn't become that way naturally. It was artificially. And that's why we are susceptible to things like cannibalism and homosexuality and things like that. That makes sense to me. And so the natural nature of man is the bestial nature. And this is the image of the serpent. The serpent is a beast. We see in Genesis that God calls the serpent a beast, that he was more cunning than any beast that God had made. And that the animal nature is the image of the serpent. It's the image of the beast. It's an image of the animal, that we partake of an animal nature, the image of the serpent. And this is why scripture calls us children of the devil. Why even Jesus refers to us as, or the Bible refers to us as children of the devil in 1 John chapter 3, verse 10, where it refers to unbelievers as children of the devil. I don't believe that's just spiritual. It's talking about our genetic code, that in our genetic code, we bear the image of the serpent, the beast, the Nephilim, the demons. They're all in the same line. And that we share that nature with them. And that the Adamic nature has been heavily, heavily edited and modified within us. It's been almost completely destroyed within us. And that we're not image bearers of God. And this brings me to my point that we are not direct descendants of Adam. We don't bear that. We are descendants of Canaan, of Ham. We are the cursed servants. We'd be a servant of servants, that we would be brought forth to be a worker race, enslaved to the Nephilim and made to serve them. And that we would be a race that has no rights to rule over the earth. And that really God's people have a right to rule over us. Now, we have the privilege of becoming God's people and being redeemed from this state, in this condition. That's what regeneration is, being made in the image of God, being remade in the image of God, in the likeness of his holiness. That we need to be born again. Why? Because our genetic code is corrupt. You see, regeneration regenerates the genetic code. It's it's a biological, it's almost like a biological change or evolution that we undergo supernaturally. It's not just this spiritual thing. It affects our biology. It changes our biology. And we need a glorified body because our bodies are corrupted by the animal nature. And that's why we act like beasts sometimes. We do things that we see beasts doing, animals doing. I think that that's consistent here. That the image of Adam has been so corrupted within us, we barely bear his image. Now, we bear enough still, I think, where we can be redeemed, and there's still hope for us, but it's very little. But there's still hope for us. But the reason why this is important to understand is because it makes sense of a lot of things. I mean, I think it's important to accept the scientific data and the scientific research. You know, this stuff is leading a lot of people astray from Christianity. You know, people look at Christianity and they're like, no, we're not apes, we're not primates. And people are like, but that's what the science shows. You want me to deny that? You know, you don't have to in this view, but you can also accept the biblical data, and you don't have to accept some weird theistic evolution, which teaches that human beings did evolve from apes naturally. No, you can believe God created Adam and Eve, and only Adam and Eve, and only two humans, and that if you hold to artificial view, you can make sense of the scientific data and the biblical data. You can accept both consistently. Some people might say, well, that's pseudoscience, okay? If it's consistent, that's all I care about. If it makes sense. I can't make sense of the traditional views that science and theologians take on these matters. Just can't make sense of it. You know, the weirdest view, I think, is the correct view. Think what you want. You can believe what you want. I'm just telling you my views, and I'm challenging your thoughts and your beliefs to consider things, and consider maybe things you haven't thought of. You know, this is what this channel is about, providing unique perspectives on things. It's something that should at least be considered. It can make sense of a whole lot. And when we talk about the age of the earth, I'll probably make a video on the age of the earth and how we can make sense of that probably in future videos. But yeah, and so, you know, let me know in the comment section what are the things you want me to talk about. I think I can provide new, unique perspectives on things and challenge you, even if you don't accept it or agree with it. At least be open to being challenged, and hopefully you don't condemn me and be like, oh, you know, you're wicked. I accept everything the church has ever accepted as orthodox. Okay, I don't reject any orthodox view. I just think it's okay to accept things that the church maybe has rejected. Well, no, not accept things the church has rejected, but accept things the church never rejected. I think it's okay to accept things the church never rejected. I mean, the church never rejected it. Never said it was a heresy. What's wrong with thinking about it? What's what's wrong with pondering it? This is how we grow. We have to be more open to grow and to think about our views. So this would really help with conversions if we're able to make sense of a lot of these things. It would help with evangelism, because people do turn away for these reasons. So, but yeah, so think about this, and again, leave comments down below. Tell me what else you want me to talk about, and leave comments about what this video was about and questions you might have about it and things like that. Critiques even. Hopefully you're not mean about it, but you know, whatever. So subscribe to the channel. I have barely any subscribers. I just started, and you know, I'm still learning, and I want to improve my quality and the way I'm making videos. But you know, I don't know how long it's going to be before I can do that, but when eventually I will. And so subscribe and like, share this video, and yeah, so I hope that you have a good rest of your day. So God bless.